So, hello everyone. Um, I have decided to add to the now plethora of US election analysis available, thankfully, I suppose, from communists who hate both candidates. And in a way, perhaps the increase in the cynical attitude towards these elections is indicative of where the US is right now. Perhaps, I guess we can see. I'm joined by one of my favorite comrades from across the Atlantic, Thomas Michelet. Did I pronounce your last name right?
Yeah, that's how I say it.
So, how are you?
Great. I'm glad to be speaking with you today.
Um, so, what's the mood been like in Detroit?
Well, Detroit itself overwhelmingly voted for Joe Biden. I'm sure, I guess even 50% voter turnout, which is the highest in many decades, long before I've been alive. So I would imagine that most people are fairly excited. Likewise, I would imagine in surrounding counties, there are a lot of people who are very upset. So I'm sure it's a
Right.
very mixed mood. But as of right now, the radio and TV are all talking about President-elect Joe Biden. So it's pretty much, it's sort of uh, made official in a way, at least until Inauguration Day. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, there are
Yeah, we should.
some people are dancing in the streets and having parades and stuff. Not that I've personally seen with my own eyes, but
Wow.
happy that Trump is going.
Right. Okay. Okay. And what is the political substance of people who are celebrating right now? What do you think their general sentiment about it is?
I'm sure it's a lot of different reasons. The racist is gone. Um, we can go back to brunch. Uh, I'm sure I'm sure there's
Are there really that?
maybe. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, are there really that many white liberal feminist women out there doing that?
I would imagine so. I mean, not that I've personally investigated, but I'm sure they're out there.
Yeah.
At least somewhat. I don't mean to say that there's like just them, but I mean, it's a lot of people would have a lot of cause to celebrate for a lot of perceived reasons. Now coronavirus will be taken seriously. We'll have a return to norms. This national nightmare will end. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of varying sentiments out there.
How much more seriously do you think coronavirus will be taken under Biden? Because that seems to be the general sentiment, and globally at the moment, coronavirus is playing pretty much the primary role in most elections anyway, or the past few elections that have happened since coronavirus has broken out. So, do you think that was the primary issue?
For a lot of people, I'm sure it was. As far as what Biden will do, he will wear a mask. Uh, he'll do that.
He'll symbolically take it seriously.
Yeah, he'll do that for sure. I remember hearing something about like a national mask initiative, which okay, um, I could see that happening. Uh, I would imagine that the federal government would emphasize more of a national approach as opposed to independent states doing whatever they will. Um, he claims that it was campaign rhetoric, but I'm not a president of just the red states or the blue states. I'm a president of all the states. And one criticism of Trump was his preference for states that politically view him favorably. So, I mean, who knows if what Biden's going to do in that regard? But that's at least his rhetorical approach to it. So as far as substance goes, perhaps some kind of mass initiative. Otherwise, I give you a few symbolic promises.
Right. Okay. So he won't do a stimulus. Like a lot of people have been, I think, talking about the possibility of him increasing the stimulus since Trump only did like one package, which was barely anything, right? Yeah.
Maybe. I mean, he already won. So, I mean, does he really need to give away money now?
Right.
Who knows?
Right. Right. And he's probably getting ready to crush protesters as we speak, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Inevitably, we'll have to. I mean, I can't imagine going into assuming that he transitions smoothly into power. Just millions of people being foreclosed on, and of the other horrors of the last year bearing fruit, I can't imagine a situation where that's happening and either protests are happening or some means of, responding to that. Yeah, it's going to be a zesty year to come.
Right. Okay. And do you think there will be resistance? Because the general sentiment I'm getting at the moment, and obviously since I'm halfway across the world, the only sentiment I can get is from social media. But the sentiment that I'm getting is that some people are preparing to protest, but they're in the minority.
Protest Biden?
Well, yeah, protest is inevitably reactionary policies.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if there's a situation where millions of people are rendered homeless and other things of that nature coming to pass, I mean, there would have to be some sort of response unless people are just going to just wither away without a peep. But I don't know about any like what the planned resistance would be. In fact, I would imagine that a lot. I mean, a lot of things could happen between now and January. But assuming Biden takes office, the people who believe that the election was just stolen from them, I mean, they would be the initiative. Like they would have the initiative as the people who are coming at the government for whatever reason it may be. So yeah, I mean, I imagine a situation where the people who are saying that we'll push Biden to the left or whatever, they're going to be in this position where they're going to be on the defense against the Trump, like the so-called Trump base, that section of the population and the right wing in general. So I don't know. I don't know what kind of I don't know who will be protesting and for what. I'm sure lots of people will be protesting for lots of reasons. But yeah, I do imagine a situation where the right wing is more politically active than they are now.
Well, I guess one of the fears has been that there would be a repeat of. I mean, I saw there was a journalist on CNN this morning, and he was actually crying because he, for some reason, thought that nobody would be stopped at the border anymore.
Was this Van Jones?
Yeah, yeah.
Weeping on TV?
Literally weeping.
Yeah, I saw that.
It was quite gross.
Interestingly, I believe in college, you purported to be a Maoist. That's what Glenn Beck said. I don't know if that's true, but that's like back in like 2011 or so. Glenn Beck was like really on Van Jones as being like a Marxist in the White House, So yeah,
it's always the Maoists who turn reactionary for some reason. I don't know what it is about Western Maoists
for whatever reason. Yeah.
No, but I don't know why. It's just a trend.
Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. So that obviously being overlooked, and I mean, perhaps Trump has awakened some level of class consciousness in people that won't be overlooked anymore. But obviously, liberalism was much stronger under the Obama years. So
yeah, a lot of the reason why people voted for Biden or would have voted Trump out is the sense of like returning to some sort of normal. So, like when Van Jones is crying on TV about like a return to decency or something, he's really expressing something that you hear on TV all the time, like that Trump breaks numerous presidential norms and he doesn't act presidential. Personally, I don't think it's worth crying about, but that's just me. Yeah, but like in general, the return to normalcy, and of course, Biden. A lot of his reputation is based on him being the VP for President Obama, and people view that time either with great longing for whatever reason. Well, because Trump is what immediately followed, and a lot of people are, view that as a time when their president was a, socialist Muslim, something like that. So, you're right. A lot of people get angry. So, I mean. If we're returning to normalcy, it's like as you said, deportations and all the things that people really at the core that make Trump a vile figure, that's not going to change.
Right, exactly, yeah. I mean, it's essentially presentability politics, isn't it? It's just we want the status quo. We just don't want someone to be honest about the status quo.
Yeah, there's a lot of that for sure. That Trump sort of takes the mask off.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, obviously, that's clearly what much of Middle America liked about him. That he was the kind of figure that probably they would speak to on a regular basis, right?
In their imagination, this New York real estate guy. But yeah,
well,
he speaks his mind. He says what he thinks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, he's a New York real estate guy, but he also talks like someone who's just a random guy, just any guy.
Right.
Right. So I think that's probably what people most liked about him, not they liked that about him, plus the fact that he's aspirational, of course.
Yeah. There was a moment at the final debate between Biden and Trump where Biden was doing his thing that he always does, is talking about like being around a kitchen table, like people out there sitting around the kitchen table, blah, blah, blah. It's one of the most cliche politician tropes in the world. And it's one that Biden uses ad nauseum just because he has limited cognitive function. And Trump said, like, I'm not a politician. Like, stop with the kitchen table talk. Just be real, And it was amazing because I was kind of thinking the same thing. Like, for real, this is so transparent and so lame, talking about being around the kitchen table, thinking about whatever, Trump
where you're
doesn't do any of that.
Where you're also sniffing the chair.
Right.
I mean, they want to play a game of presentability politics. I don't know exactly where Biden technically fits into that anyway.
Right, you can't present him at all. He even wears shades to hide his melting face. That's what he's resorted to in the last couple of weeks.
That was most commonly demonstrated, I think, by that slip up that he had the other night, where he said we've created the most inclusive voter fraud organization in history. and the liberal media immediately went on to, like, the fact checkers on Twitter and Facebook immediately went on to, correcting people and saying, well, no, he was taken out of context. He actually wasn't. He never called himself on that.
Fact checkers.
Yeah. But obviously he is just senile or whatever.
Literally incapable for some reason.
Yeah, well, I mean, how old is the man? He's 70 years old, I think. And
like
it is
78
funny.
Or something.
Yeah, and it seems like very taboo to talk about his limited capabilities for some reason.
Like the emperor wears no clothes, and that's what that sounds like.
There's an interesting theory that Harris is going to take over in the first term.
Yeah, I could see that. It not even as like some like nefarious plot to like make her president, but even barring no nefarious plot to make her president, the man can't do it. He can't live like this. I mean, what's he gonna do? You see how quickly presidents deteriorate within their term. It's actually pretty remarkable how much they age. And the man is, given where he is right now, by that time his eye exploded when he was giving a speech. Like, it turned all red, and you never saw that?
No.
Like, the man can't be. Coronavirus was the best thing to happen for the Biden campaign because it was like the anti-campaign. It was literally keep this man in bed all day long, and that's what he needs to do to win. I don't think he can do that, last that long.
Yeah, I mean, he's missing a trick, but then again, the trick for Trump probably is meth or something like that.
Yeah, something.
Some kind of upper. Let's be real.
You can tell.
So one of the things that's terrifying for me as an outsider watching the election than someone who doesn't have to deal with American domestic policy, which is obviously why I tend not to comment on American domestic policy in general, because it's not my domain, right? But like, it seems that Biden, in a way, represents the return of credibility on the international stage for America. He is good friends with the former NATO Secretary General, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, I believe. I've forgotten exactly the name. And he was obviously the person who supervised the destruction of Libya. And
Right.
John Negroponte, who organized the Contras in Nicaragua and supervised IS in Iraq. To me, it seems as though he'll be able to do what many of the critics of Trump, who didn't like how ineffective of an imperialist he was, were unhappy about, and that is sort of return NATO to some semblance of coherence again. Do you see that being something that Biden will successfully do? Do you think it's possible to return NATO to its previous form now?
Yeah, Biden is definitely an attempt at returning to that sort of global governance that Trump represents an aberration from. I do think that much is true. I would imagine though that countries such as Iran or others who, okay, like if the Obama administration in a lot of instances such as Iran, if their approach to maintenance of the imperialist order is to, make deals to maybe try and burrow what from within a country such as Iran, taking negotiating here and there, being hawkish in other ways. I couldn't imagine that the credibility of the United States will ever be what it was, because it's been proven that it's possible for some unstable element to completely disrupt whatever negotiations and whatever maybe softer strategy the U.S. may take on a country here and there. Like it can be argued that the killing of Qasem Soleimani in the beginning of this year was a way to just tear up the nuclear Iran deal and make sure that one never comes again.
Right.
Yeah, there's definitely an attempt to get back to that way of doing things, but
I do wonder though, because I've seen a lot of people on the left, sort of say, well, that's a possible advantage in sort of seeing Biden as a lesser evil, is that he would want to rejoin the JCPOA. But I'm not 100% sure, honestly, why that's advantageous personally, because I mean,
yeah, I don't know.
It's in a way, it sort of led to Iran kind of saying, well, okay, we've seen the history that has occurred with the DPRK. We've seen the history that has occurred with Libya, in particular Libya, right, where they were promised that if they just stopped building, they got rid of their nuclear weapons program, that they would be fine and they wouldn't be overthrown in the way that they were. It kind of seems like Iran has just sort of said, okay, well, obviously we can't trust the US. We'll have to continue ahead with a nuclear weapons program.
Or nuclear energy program.
Yeah, right, yeah. So I don't see why that would be advantageous personally for Iran to then turn around and place faith in the US again. I mean, I'm sure there are key figures in Iran who did want the JCPOA at the time, but
when Rouhani, who is considered to be a reformer, when the Iran nuclear deal was come to within the country, the so-called hardliners were essentially saying like, oh, well, okay, if this doesn't work out, well, you guys are done. You're not going to be in power any longer. So I would imagine that within Iran, those voices that were skeptical of the deal to begin with, I would imagine that after the killing of Qasem Soleimani, that the credibility of the reformers with regards to their attitude towards the United States, I would imagine that they're very discredited within Iran. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of people who still would like to negotiate with the United States in that capacity, but I would think that they would be discredited, at least more than they were, a year ago.
Yeah, and I mean, even just looking at for example, Biden was a key figure in the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya. So that they're now he's now supposed to be a better diplomat in that regard. For what reason? Certainly not on the basis of his history, right?
Yeah. I would see in Biden with regards to foreign affairs as basically being the kinds of people that could be like personified by the Hillary Clinton State Department, those and the Bush administration. Those are the sorts of people who will be in charge. So, I guess I would be surprised if Iran and the United States come to redo the agreement that they had previously reached.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So then, of course, we have Harris, and she has given that now probably relatively infamous APAC speech where she said, if this capital crumbled to the ground, the one thing that would remain is our commitment to our aid with and our cooperation with Israel.
I didn't know she said that. Interesting.
She did. Yes.
It's literally an Israel first policy.
It literally is. And I mean, to some degree, you can't blame Americans for pointing the finger at the Democrats and saying you don't actually have America first when they literally say they don't have America first.
Yeah. America first is on the surface a very innocuous slogan. Seems like, I don't know, fairly self-evident that that's what a country usually does. But I guess in our political environment that we have, it necessarily takes on, I don't know, implications that would mean Israel's not first, maybe? I don't know. But you can't have that.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, it would be a completely innocuous statement if what Trump had originally meant by that was protectionism and genuinely bringing manufacturing back and actually ending wars, right?
Right.
Which, to some degree, it's still arguable he did to a much lesser degree than he said he would, but like much. There are still variations, right, in terms of the amount of imperialist activities that he engaged in comparison to the Democrats.
Yeah. Well, when he says it's 100% a chauvinist statement because it's basically saying we're getting screwed by China and everyone else, so we have to, stick it to them. So that's the connotation that it actually takes in practice out of his mouth.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So that's another one. The picks for Secretary of Defense seem pretty interesting. So Rice's possible contender is Chris Murphy, who wrote a document which was essentially focused almost entirely on containing Russia and China. And then you have Michelle Flerney. She doesn't seem to be talked about a lot, aside from obviously people on the far left. She's a war hawk, pretty overly concerned with China herself as well. So I think one of the interesting things is that a lot of the far left kind of analysis thus far has been, well, the Dems are going to be overly concerned with Russia and we're going to be, overly concerned with Russia, and it was just Trump who wanted this Cold War with China. Whereas I think that was what was going to happen from the get-go. It's just that Trump took America there maybe 10 times faster than any other successor may have. So it does seem to be something that, regardless, it's something the permanent state cares about rather than just, any one particular candidate.
What's that, China?
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. 100% agree.
Yeah. So one of the things that Michelle Flerney said was defense budgets are probably going to flatten in the coming years, no matter who wins the election. That means you have to make trade-offs and you have to make hard decisions, which means you probably need to buy fewer legacy forces in order to invest in the technologies that will actually make the force that you keep more relevant, more survivable, more combat effective, and better able to underwrite deterrence. So to me, what this implies is that she's been looking into the technological advances that the China has been making in their military production over the past few years. And she's realizing that if they win the AI war, that America are screwed. And so her main task, I think what would probably happen under her is a significantly higher level of investment into Silicon Valley to ensure that the military are advancing at the same speed as China.
Yeah.
In a way, it's kind of scary because, I guess Pompeo had this sort of, coming of Jesus kind of evangelical form of imperialism, it almost seemed like. And she seems to have this very pragmatic and also possibly highly effective kind of attitude towards the defense strategy, right? Which I think it's in a way scarier.
Yeah, I actually think that's more effective.
Yeah. To me, that seems scarier.
Yeah, and I mean, let's not forget even the phrase "pivot to China" refers to something that was initiated by President Obama with the focus on East Asia and containing China, so-called. So, and even from the Chinese point of view, just from my admittedly limited exposure to Chinese media, the attitude seems to be that whoever were to win, Biden or Trump, they're both going to be harder on China. But at least with Biden, you get a more predictable approach and potentially a willingness to adhere to the established international norms, whereas Trump is more of an erratic force. But on the other hand, Trump discredits imperialism in a way that Biden wouldn't, so it can play into their hands. But I believe that from their point of view, either option is, because you're right, it's an objective hurdle for imperialism is the rise of China. It's not something that can be ignored. It's only a question of approach, but the intent is the same in any case.
Right, exactly. And in a way, it's obviously because the US has to confront how it will deal with the rising Chinese market. I mean, it's just inevitable that it has to confront it at this point. And it's never going to confront it in a way that essentially says we're going to respond to your rise by either becoming protectionist or by developing some kind of diplomatic mutual trade organization where the US loses out to some degree. So, yeah. So the other thing, I guess, with NATO is that, obviously Trump completely alienated Merkel and Germany, which in a way accelerated the gas pipeline deal with Russia, which now kind of cements Western Europe's reliance on the East, I suppose, in a way that makes most of the war hawks in the Democratic Party and probably many in the Republicans very nervous. So I think that's probably something that Biden will now be scrambling to try and deal with as well.
Yeah, I think so too. And a lot of what, I think so too. And coming like in the 2010s, you really saw the emergence of certain parties in Europe that, I don't know, are, like the whole rise of populism and so-called illiberalism and so on. There is that occurring in Europe, and that does have much to do with their relationship to Russia vis-a-vis the United States. That's what I think a lot of, even within the United States, much, not all of among the numerous contradictions that between that the United States has in particular is the relationship between Europe and Russia. I mean, it would seem like logical from the ruling class of Europe's point of view to get its oil and gas from Russia. It's right there. It can get it cheaply. But if you have a force that's, I don't know, trying to wrestle you in its direction, you'd think that there would emerge some form of politics. Like, I've heard, I mean, you could speculate that like AFD in Germany is sort of representative of that phenomenon, that desire to be closer to Russia, if for no other reason than just basic convenience, national interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. I mean, it is completely national interest for them, but it's possible that under a different American leadership, where America wasn't completely insulting and attempting to undermine the EU, that it might have gone a different way, right? Obviously, I think they have their saving grace in Britain right now post-Brexit, given all of the new trade deals that Britain will be forming with the US. But at the same time, I think they feel like to some degree they've lost Western Europe because Merkel and some other Western European countries seem increasingly disinterested in American antics, really. So I think that it was probably symbolic of something scary to them in the longer term.
Although I wonder if, to what extent, Trump is like, or represents a force that's anti-NATO, or maybe represents some general trend that has more to do with just a reorganization of global imperialism. Because I mean, like he's very popular in Poland. He's very popular in Hungary. They have governments that are considered to be both illiberal, just like Trump is, and anti-EU, but they're not anti-NATO. Like, I mean, they're viciously anti-Russian. They are allied with the United States very strongly. So it's not as if the idea of sort of a transnational military imperialist arrangement, I don't think that that's what's in question, or at least I don't think that's what is being proposed to be scrapped, as much as there's something is happening where the end of history is not the end of history, I guess. There's different, I don't know.
Well, Fukuyama was wrong from the get-go. We can say that.
Yeah, it's obviously wrong. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's like self-evident at this point.
2020
so yeah, I mean,
Fukuyama's end.
I've heard people say that Trump ultimately strengthened NATO by requesting that they spend more of their GDP percentage on their own arms. I mean, I guess that would have. I mean, I'm only speculating, but I would imagine that would rub the French or rub the British or rub whoever the wrong way. But maybe I don't know if NATO. The only reason why I think NATO would be weaker after Trump is like just the confidence in a reliable, stable U.S. ally. To just be consistent. That's the way that I see NATO primarily undermined.
Yeah. So the other thing that Biden is predicted to be entering back into, or that to be trying to enter the U.S. back into, is the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal. And obviously, that was something that countries throughout Asia would have been significantly disadvantaged by, regardless of the fact that our governments were quite fond of the idea. For example, here, it would have quite literally removed our ability to regulate companies, because an example of that is that we had plain packaging laws on cigarette companies, and like major monopolies who own cigarettes here, where they essentially forced them to put advertisements of people dying on the cigarettes, essentially. They fought that to hell. They fought that in the courts, etc., as long as they could, and they weren't successful. But under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, there would have been an international court specifically for private companies, weighted in favor of private companies, where they would have been able to sue the Australian government, essentially. And that would have applied to pretty much every country within that agreement. Like you have Vietnam, for example, may be forced out of producing something that might have been slightly more complex in terms of manufacturing, because they have to reprioritize something simpler, which in the longer term keeps them in a form of poverty. So it was a very, very fucking bad trade deal for the world, essentially. And it looks like Biden was quite a fan of it, and now people are speculating that it might come back. Do you think that's a possibility?
Was that what Trump called the worst trade deal in the history of trade deals, or was that now?
No, that was him wanting to take Australian refugees.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean,
that was literally just our government trying to pass refugees onto the US.
oh, that's the worst trade deal in the history of trade deals?
Yeah, it was actually just stupid. Yeah, continue.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think you are wrong. I mean, Biden sort of, I mean, like we sort of like the theme of what we've been saying is like Biden is an attempt to go back, sort of like a reset in a way. Is at least an attempt to do that. And that's what, like that's what seems to be the driving force behind all the old neocons sort of getting together and rallying behind Biden is sort of to remake the bipartisan consensus with regards to how to deal with the outside world. Not least of which trade deals. I mean, even just like an attitude towards NATO and whatever. I mean, it's kind of, no matter what it is, go down the line, it seems to be an attempt to go back to something that Trump represents an aberration of. Um, so yeah, I mean, I would say you're probably right.
In a way, it almost makes him the accelerationist candidate, right? Because sort of neoliberalism is accelerationism as well.
Right.
It's just less splintering from most people yet.
Yeah, it's not, Trump isn't like a well managed decline or even a very good attempt at reversing it. So it is sort of a matter of inevitability.
According to the Lincoln Project, this project that I guess it was like a newly formed organization, which was like sort of anti-Trump coalition. And it was funded by, there's a bunch of different billionaires: Gordon Getty, the heir of the Hyatt Hotel; John Pritzker, the Cargill heiress Gwendolyn Sondheim. So they they all recently, the head, Michael Steele, he recently said that the goal was.
Is it the same Michael Steele, the former chair of the GOP?
Possibly.
Okay.
I'm honestly not sure.
Very well could be.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, probably. So yeah, he said the goal was to resurrect the Republican Party in a way that it could become a governing majority in the future.
Right. Okay.
So
yeah.
So it seems to me like the goal wasn't just to get Biden in and Trump out, but also probably to create such a conservative Democratic candidate that it creates a sort of or placates the country for the next round of Republican leadership, right?
Very well could be. Although I would struggle to see a situation in which running for the Democratic Party next time is Kamala Harris to resume being president versus a Republican of like the John Kasich kind of like plain lame, like a rerun of a lot of the clowns who ran in 2012 to be the Republican nominee. I would just see things moving in such a way that, like, I keep on emphasizing that Biden is sort of represents like an attempt to go back to something. I don't think that it's possible to do that. I mean, it's like the pendulum is swinging just objectively in the other way of alternative politics, of just the various strains of populism. I don't think they can go back to like the old like Cold War normal or even like the immediate post 9/11 normal. I don't think that's possible.
Well, it could ultimately be their goal, and it could be what they're funding their billions towards. But perhaps they're just completely misreading the general popular sentiment right now, where clearly Trump's not going to shut up, and his fans are not going to shut up and just simply go away.
And the people who voted for Bernie, they're not going to shut up. And then the hungry and the homeless and the people without shoes, or they're not going to go away. So the whole Cold War normal is at least in part based on a certain level of internal stability and the means to provide decent livings. And a lot of that is because of labor unions and just global imperialism being in a different phase. I mean, now just the world that accompanied the Cold War normal is just not there. So, I mean, good luck. Unless there's going to be one party that represents that Cold War normal, that in this election was a Democratic Party. Going forward, I don't think it's going to be two parties that are, Reagan used to say that we're all friends after six. There's a bipartisan consensus, essentially. They're all friends at the end of the day. I don't think that's what politics is going to be defined by. And the Trump era, in a lot of ways, indicates that that's not, that the direction is not we're all friends after six.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, in a way, as well, nothing has kind of returned since the Reagan era. I mean, I think it was under his leadership that union donations to the PACs dropped by about 70%. So yeah, so him completely smashing the union movement. I mean, obviously Truman before him, I think, began deregulation of a bunch of, U.S. infrastructure. But
I think was under,
yeah. But Reagan was kind of the main architect of this destruction of the union movement, from what I can tell. And obviously, nothing has returned since then, because it seems a very familiar story. It's similar in Britain and Australia, right? You have the right-wing party gets in, smashes the workers' movement. The left-wing party gets in on the promise of some return to normalcy, but they don't actually do anything about the initial destruction of the economic base, right? But yeah, it seems to be a very familiar story that, again, we'll be facing under Biden. And, America's facing a crossroads right now because a rising China, and I believe they did literally just get named, economically above the US right now.
Largest economy, I believe.
Yeah. And I mean, in many ways, in many kind of metrics, they already have been for a long time anyway. So it seems to me that they are, America's facing a crossroads because, their only strategy for surviving the past few recessions has been just, create more debt and hope that other countries will buy up their debt markets. And obviously, China has been the major consumer of the US debt market. And they're aware that if China pulled the plug on that in any second, America would experience extreme currency fluctuation and, internal economic crisis, right? So
sounds like a very sound economic model.
And a completely sustainable one in the long term as well.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that, and that's obviously as a result of this reality of not having any real production base, almost entirely a service economy. It's probably one of the major indicators of a superior, well, not superior, but a major imperialist power, right? It seems that obviously, because that's not sustainable, their only option is either to force China to open the market and to start, picking off pieces of it, or return to an export economy. And a return to an export economy would mean inflation for quite a while, which would in turn set America back economically in terms of their status to near global South levels, right? That is something that I think that America is currently facing. And I think it's another reason why, people on some unreconstructed level are looking at America and thinking, oh, it's the collapse of Western civilization. It's the end times, right?
Right.
Because in some ways, it means that as China has gone from an export economy and developing in such a way, they've moved from that. They're now moving from that into consumption, and increased consumption economy for China means they don't have to rely on U.S. debt markets to be a sort of stabilizer against instability or a certain financial instability in the longer term, right? And because obviously the creation of a reserve currency in various parts of the Asia Pacific is increasingly successful for them now. China is increasingly moving towards a kind of sophisticated economy and the US would have to move back to what China was in maybe the 60s, for example.
Yeah.
So
A lot of Maoists might like that.
Sorry?
A lot of Maoists might like that.
Well, yeah, Maoist, third worldist, yeah. Yeah, but it seems that they have no other option. I'm not entirely sure where the US can go from here. An export economy, of course, for the people at the bottom would still be extremely advantageous, right? Because it would actually produce an economy that Trump promised, where the manufacturing comes back, and you know, as a result, workers have a much more stable, probably something closer to full employment. The possibility for over casualization to decrease would increase, right? So it's something that would benefit the people at the bottom anyway, I think. But it wouldn't benefit, I don't know, the people who've made your Uber millionaires and your whoever else, right?
Yeah.
Probably wouldn't benefit Elon Musk.
Right. Probably not.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, when the United States was in its economic heyday post World War II, it certainly was an immense exporter. Though of course that has a lot to do with all of its competitors being in ruins and being like the sole means by which imperialism can, uh, return in the face of the Soviet Union. But in the face of a rising China today, um, it does seem like the end of the world for the ruling class. I would imagine any ruling class, when it seems as though their system itself is coming to an end, it's easier to imagine that the world itself is coming to an end. So yeah, I don't think that I don't think that imperialism itself in this era of AI, 3D printers, and the internet can even. I don't think there really is much of a path forward for them while an alternative exists in the world.
In a way, I guess, like you're saying in the context of AI and automation and so on, you could still become an export economy. It just means that Americans wouldn't be doing the sort of they wouldn't be operating along the lower end of the supply chain, right? Like the workers wouldn't be functioning on the lower end of the supply chain. They would probably, I mean, the only alternative if you were to move towards a production, a heavily more invest in a heavy input production economy, would be to essentially do something similar to what Yang was promising, but everyone hated Yang among the American left so much. I don't honestly really know why. Yeah, I mean, like, I'm sure it's probably that he's a venture capitalist and that he wanted to maybe that he wanted to undermine confidence in like government-run like welfare systems and so on, right? Possibly that's a probability, but at the same time, something like what he was promising, where you have heavy, like a heavy welfare state, where most people move into some kind of jobs run by government, like social programs and so on, as opposed to basic manufacturing work or whatever. So I guess that's a possibility in the longer term. I don't think that would prevent America from becoming an export economy, but it would. The fact that no American government would want to create that kind of system would prevent America from becoming an export economy, right?
That's true too.
Yeah.
But you mentioned workers in the United States might not be at the bottom of that supply chain. That's what I think. China being like a global alternative, like the United States being an imperialist country and like trying to remake itself economically at the expense, presumably, of other people around the world, with China as the alternative. That's kind of what seems to be like, I don't know, the flaw in the plan, so to speak. I mean, I think China is what is like the main like game changer in the world as they continue to rise. It seems to be like, I don't know, looking like from like a God's eye view, the main factor in the global shift that we're seeing in a lot of ways.
Right. Yeah. No. What I meant by Americans wouldn't be at the bottom of the supply chain is that robots would.
Oh, I thought you meant. I thought you were
Yeah.
saying third world countries.
No. Like if America, for example, became an export economy again,
Oh,
it
okay.
probably wouldn't be the case that Americans would be doing those jobs. It'd probably be the case that robots would.
I,
Um,
I, yeah. I think it's a pipe dream. The idea that imperialism will be maintained and within the United States, workers, humans will have a more decent life, and then robots will do the. I don't know that well, I take it. Fine. I'll take it as a step in the right direction, but as a hard sell.
yeah. Well, that's what I mean. Like, it would be feasible if there was a strong welfare state where people had, welfare to the degree that it was like the same amount you would earn in a middle class income job,
Yeah.
right? But obviously, all Yang was promising was, I think, like $1,000 a month. Um,
Right. Essentially, would probably be like to opt out of welfare.
Yeah, with the option to opt out of welfare, whereas the ideal system would be, a system where the welfare was handed out by the government, but it was at a middle class income rate, and it was funded using progressive taxation as opposed to, I think he proposed a goods and income tax, which it creates a heavy amount of inflation. No one likes that. We experience like goods and income like an increased goods and income tax under the John Howard years in Australia, and it's not a popular policy. So I think that So if he funded it via progressive taxation instead, then it's feasible, right? But obviously, it's like you said, a pipe dream in terms of the American political class right now.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be the direction that they're like the preservation of the labor aristocracy that is dwindling and dwindling is not the direction that they should be going.
Right. Yeah, and so I mean, also obviously with the One Belt One Road, that's something that really scares the American political classes as well, because their countries are increasingly allowed to develop alongside China, given that China's policy towards developing nations tends to be one of mutual benefit, right?
Win-win.
Yeah, exactly. Ethiopia is a great example of that. I think they've been one of the fastest rising countries in the past 5 years, and they've experienced heavy investment from China, which they've massively benefited from, clearly. And so, that's something that I think America is going to, they're consistently losing access to markets of cheap labor, cheap resources, and so on. And that's something that I think obviously terrifies them as well. Which would in the longer term create inflation also. So I think that's very scary for them.
That's good.
Yeah.
China is like an existential threat to imperialism in a way completely different than the way the USSR was projected to be, as like either a force like sowing revolutionary discord within countries, the global communist menace. Not in that way, and not in a way that the USSR is going to drop the bomb on us and like a Red Dawn scenario. It's more just like fundamentally undermining the economic foundation of the current global order. It's like a different sort of, but it literally is an existential threat in the way that the Soviet Union wasn't, despite all the bluster.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the USSR actually, while it was, maybe in the earlier years by many communists watching across the world, probably would have been perceived as the communist nation who had the least reactionary foreign policy, right? Because there was a period where China has had quite reactionary foreign policy. And they probably were perceived as like the saviors of the world. Like I remember, I think it was Gamal Abdel Nasser who genuinely thought that Soviet soldiers were going to parachute in from the sky and save him. So there was a period where they thought, sorry, no, not Nasser. I'm having a mind blank. It was Jun Blat. Jun Blat thought that Soviet soldiers were going to parachute in from the sky.
Okay.
Yeah. And so obviously they have had this, they were perceived as a savior kind of in their time, or the potential savior. And
justifiably so.
yeah, but nowadays China has actually managed to kind of achieve more in terms of international influence than the Soviet Union could have. Um, uh, I mean, obviously because they were coming off the back of a world war, so that was another factor as well. But yeah, but it's funny though because there's been a sort of that sort of inverse has managed to occur, because I suppose they did hide their might, they did hide their power, and now that policy is gone, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're right. China has been, well, probably will continue to be one of the most influential countries under the rhetoric of socialism in the next coming decade.
And it's not it's not like an isolated country. It's, as you mentioned, I mean, with Ethiopia, it's a country that's very outward looking, and for that reason, and based on different economic foundations, it does represent an existential threat to the global imperialist order. I'd say every day more and more so.
Right. Yeah. So it's very memed at the moment that the US in some way represents the similarities to the collapse of the Roman Empire. I've seen a lot of people have this discussion. To some degree, it's true. I mean, I think, like I've said to you in the past, they aren't facing military, like America's not facing military threat on its borders, and it won't anytime soon. And I guess in the sense, obviously the right also make this comparison a lot, but I think for them, they perceive it as the, internal degenerates taking down the US. And
which they also, by the way, have been saying for a long time that that's why Rome ended up falling anyway, because of immigration and moral decay and these things.
Right, and the gays didn't cause the collapse of the Roman Empire. That's just clearly not what happened.
Right, during Rome's heyday, I'm sure that it was gayer than it was when it collapsed.
Yeah, basically. Well, they inherited that from many of the former nations that they colonized as well, right? Sure. So, but I guess I guess we can make that comparison in the sense that they had constant wars and overspending had significantly lightened their, I guess, their coffers or their treasury or whatever you would like to call it. And, increased taxation and then inflation led to a widened gap between rich and poor, which, as we've been saying for the past however many minutes, that's something that America is looking down the barrel of, significant inflation. Many members of the wealthy in the Roman Empire fled and, set up like independent fiefdoms. But I guess the comparison into America could be fleeing to tax havens, for example.
Right, or Elon Musk trying to go to Mars.
Well, only Passadism is a possibility now.
Or space feudalism coming out of the collapse of global imperialism, maybe.
Right, right. So yeah, and so obviously, they because they relied on slavery to till the fields and so on. They had, they were, as they continued on, their supply of slaves was drying up because of the fact that they had no, they were losing so many wars. And I guess in a way there's a comparison that can be made there in the sense of, there may be increasingly less markets to put the factories for cheap labor and so on, right? Obviously, that's something very far down the line that could be drawn as a comparison, I suppose. So, yeah, and with its economy faltering and agricultural production was in decline, I believe they were facing climate crisis around a similar time as well. And then and that's when the empire began to decline. And it is what is historically perceived as the center of Western civilization. So there are some comparisons. I just obviously the right or wrong. It's not the satanic hordes or the
right.
It's not immigrants crossing the borders and so on.
Right. Yeah. The similarity for me, the main similarity would be general civilizational decline. I'd say that much for sure. I mean, yeah, militarily, you're right. There's no like Germanic hordes like busting through Roman like U.S. territory or whatever. But you're right. There is like a bloated, overinflated, extended, seemingly endless drive for war, which most people are sick of.
Particularly if they lose the AI war too, because then the military, the second that you're slightly lower in terms of technological capacity these days, I mean, we can talk about singularity as an extremely abstract concept, and I don't really like talking about it in that sense because I think it's just too abstract for me. But it's one of those things that because AI technology can exceed at such a fast pace that the second China inches ahead, America already it's game over, right? Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that they will have spent quite a lot of money, possibly not to win the AI war as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's true. I don't know what historical parallel I could think of with that, but in general, yes, with civilizational decline, and I don't think it's just the United States. I mean, when I was in high school, a teacher explaining NATO to us said that it's almost like a football team, and the United States is the quarterback. He's like the main guy. And I look at the United States as out of World War II as sort of being like the steward of global imperialism. And there's certain, from a Marxist point of view, it would seem as though there's certain contradictions that we've already discussed that are necessitating its decline. And in that sense, there is like Western civilization, i.e., European, American, Australian, like the whole single imperialist order itself is in decline. So yeah, I mean, in that sense, it's like when Rome collapses, like the Roman world is something that collapsed. It's like a whole world in and of itself, and that's what imperialism at this stage, like literally, is a world imperialism. So yeah, its collapse will be ugly for many. Likewise with Rome. But in this case, there is one world, and China is also in this world. So it's not just going to be like, I don't know that it'll be the Dark Ages while the world is as small as it is, and technology is what it is, and China is what it is. So
right.
Yeah, I do. There are parallels, of course.
Well, the other thing is that there's like hopeful things to take away from the possibility of this sort of comparison with the collapse of the Roman Empire too, right? In the sense that it provides more opportunity. I mean, for us, even though we may have some sense of the nation that we belong to, despite that, we still have a greater level of patriotism to our class, right? It seems to me that there's plenty of opportunity for workers to be able to take advantage of a scenario where capital flight is occurring, and capital flight might be occurring in America, for example, or inflation increasing and the possible necessity of becoming an export economy, for example. Like that's their opportunities to begin demanding working rights, to begin saying we are a necessity again. Your economy cannot function without us anymore. Like previously we were nothing but expendable kind of contract workers in your service economies, but now you need us for something more important. So to some degree, it seems like there's hopeful possibility there to begin taking advantage of a dire economic situation where not just workers are losing, capitalists are losing too, you know? Mm-hmm. So I'm obviously not 100% sure, but there doesn't need to be a sort of, well, okay, everything's collapsing, now we descend into nihilism and send ourselves into a drug-fueled haze, you know?
Right. Definitely, I'm not advocating for that.
Yeah, no, I just want to make it clear that that's not the message I'm trying to give out.
No. Yeah, neither of us are saying anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so, you know, and obviously, like, here we see the hopeful possibilities in that as well, because if America is humiliated by China in some way, particularly in a military conflict, although let's pray for that not to occur anytime soon, I think that it would almost certainly mean that all of America's Asia Pacific allies would completely disappear, pretty much like that. You know, the second that Australia learns that America is no longer the major maritime security in the world, we're out of there.
Yeah, what is that? I know you've been asking, well, not sort of asking questions, but I want to prompt you. What do you think the decline of imperialism in the United States in particular, what does it mean for Australia?
Well, it means that we would become culturally and economically much closer to China. Because obviously we've always been incredibly reliant on China in terms of trade policy. And there have been periods throughout our history where obviously some prime ministers have balanced that relationship better than others. You know, like some prime ministers have been extremely, you know, gracious towards China and have done quite a lot to open up our markets to China and so on. Sometimes, like in the case of Paul Keating, he was the architect of neoliberalism in the country, but he was also very pro-China. So there's some contradictions there. But it would mean not just that we rebalance or reestablish our economic relationship with China, but that we would become culturally close to China. But that's one of the things that terrifies I'll just call our current government the Tories, because that's kind of what we do anyway. They're called the Liberals, but they're essentially Tories. People would probably understand that reference better.
Sure.
And so basically, like they are ideological. Like they're a very ideological party. They obviously are completely bought by America and completely, subservient to America. But they are also ideologically terrified of the concept of a country preaching socialism, regardless of how socialist anyone thinks China actually is, a country that is undeniably preaching socialism. They're terrified of the possibility that we would become culturally closer in that way, which would also be beneficial for the left. So I guess there's two crossroads. There's either the crossroads where we essentially continue to simp for America and we go down with you. And basically, I'm probably talking about this too much now, but I probably think the most likely scenario would be that there would be so much conflict, because already there is. I don't know if you saw the China trade sanction deal where they essentially have unofficially sanctioned about $6 billion worth of our exports. Yeah. Basically, I think that would result in, it's already resulting in members of the capitalist class, you know, almost storming parliament and saying, find us a new market. What have you done? Basically. So I think there would be so much internal crisis among the capitalist class, and include like even our mining billionaires. One of our mining billionaires literally invited a diplomat from the Chinese embassy to one of the prime minister's press conferences to interrupt him and say what a great job China had done during coronavirus. Wow. Yeah. So there would be quite a lot of conflict between our capitalist class and the political classes. And it's essentially how long can the CIA hold off our capitalist class? Like that's the contradiction. Right. Essentially. because
Okay.
you know, obviously we have a history of any prime minister who becomes too close to China in the longer term, not just who becomes too close to China, if they also want to like, do a mining tax or nationalize our mines, they get cooed by the CIA. So,
okay,
yeah, and that's like established at this point. John Pilger's done a lot of investigative work on that. So yeah, so I think that like it's basically our capitalist class versus the CIA. Who will win? That is the
yeah.
scenario.